The courtroom went completely silent when Karen Whitmore smiled and said, "That never happened." She said it with the kind of confidence that made everyone in the room believe she had rehearsed the sentence before she ever walked through the doors. Across the courtroom, a 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Brooks sat perfectly still, both hands wrapped around a small brown envelope that looked older than the case itself. Judge Judy did not answer Karen. She simply looked at her. Then she glanced down at the envelope, then back at Karen, and asked one simple question. That question would take less than 10 seconds to ask. But before the morning was over, Karen's entire version of events would begin collapsing piece by piece. And the strangest part? Judge Judy appeared to know something was wrong long before Karen realized she had already stepped into the trap. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you are subscribed for more courtroom stories like this. And comment below where you are watching from, because this case is about to take a turn that nobody in that courtroom expected. The dispute looked simple on paper. Karen claimed Eleanor owed her $8, $400 for repairs to a small rental property that Eleanor had inherited from her late sister. Karen said she had completed the work. She said Eleanor had approved the repairs. She said the elderly woman had simply changed her mind afterward and was refusing to pay. Karen arrived prepared to look like the responsible professional. She had a neat folder printed invoices, photographs, a typed timeline, even a statement from a contractor she claimed had helped oversee the work. Everything about her presentation suggested organization. Eleanor had almost none of that. Her paperwork was handwritten. Some receipts were folded twice. One page had a coffee stain across the corner. And inside the little brown envelope was a single brass key attached to a faded piece of blue string. It looked almost meaningless. Karen had already noticed it. She had even laughed quietly when Eleanor placed it on the table. That tiny laugh mattered more than Karen understood, because Eleanor had not brought the key to prove she owned a door. She had brought it because that key represented the one thing she believed Karen had forgotten. The truth: Eleanor had inherited the little house after her sister, Margaret, passed away. It was not a mansion. It was not some valuable investment property. It was a modest two-bedroom home on a quiet street where Eleanor's sister had lived for more than 30 years. After the funeral, Eleanor decided she would repair the house and rent it to help cover her own living expenses. That was when Karen entered the story. Karen presented herself as someone who could handle everything. She promised Eleanor the repairs would be finished quickly. She promised the costs would stay within the agreed budget. And, most importantly, she promised Eleanor she would not have to worry about anything. For an older woman grieving the loss of her sister, that promise sounded like kindness. But according to Eleanor, the relationship changed after the first payment. The invoices became larger. The explanations became shorter, and the friendly phone calls became increasingly difficult to return. Still, Eleanor did not come to court looking angry. That was one of the first things Judge Judy noticed. She looked tired, not defeated. Tired, there is a difference. A defeated person often searches the room for someone to rescue them. Eleanor did not. She kept looking at the little brass key. Judge Judy noticed that too. Karen, meanwhile, seemed almost amused. She leaned back slightly and folded her arms. The posture said everything. She believed the evidence was on her side. She believed the paperwork would win. And most importantly, she believed Eleanor was exactly the kind of person a confident storyteller could overwhelm. Karen's version was straightforward. She claimed Eleanor had approved additional repairs. She claimed Eleanor had repeatedly promised to pay. She claimed the project had cost more because Eleanor kept changing her mind. Then Karen made her first mistake. She looked directly at Eleanor and said, "Honestly, Your Honor, I think she's confused about what she agreed to." Eleanor lowered her eyes. Her fingers tightened around the envelope. Judge Judy did not react immediately. That silence was important. Because when someone cannot defeat the facts, one of the easiest strategies is to attack the person carrying them. Karen was not just defending herself anymore. She was quietly asking the courtroom to doubt Eleanor's memory, but Judge Judy had seen that tactic before. She had also seen something else. Karen's confidence was almost too polished. Every answer came quickly. Every explanation sounded prepared. Every time Eleanor tried to speak, Karen seemed ready with another interruption. Experienced judges know that a confident answer is not necessarily a truthful answer. Sometimes confidence is simply preparation wearing a suit. Judge Judy began asking small questions, nothing dramatic. What date did the first payment arrive? Who purchased the materials? When did the repairs begin? Who gave permission for the additional work? Karen answered each one. Quickly. Too quickly. Then Judge Judy asked about the photographs. Karen immediately pointed to a stack of printed images showing the property before and after the alleged repairs. She smiled. "This proves the work was done," Karen said. Judge Judy looked at the photographs. Then at Eleanor, then back at Karen. The courtroom still appeared ordinary. No one knew that the photographs were about to become less important than something Karen had left out. Because Eleanor had not come to court with the strongest evidence. She had come with the evidence Karen thought was irrelevant. The little brass key. Judge Judy reached toward the envelope, but stopped before touching it. She looked at Eleanor. "Where did you get that?" Eleanor took a breath. "My sister gave it to me." Karen rolled her eyes. That was the second mistake. Judge Judy saw it. And for the first time that morning, Karen's smile disappeared. The courtroom did not understand why, but Judge Judy did. She had just found the thread. Now she only needed to pull it. Because that key was connected to a room Karen claimed had never existed. And inside that room was something that could prove whether Karen's entire story had been built on a lie. The question Judge Judy was about to ask sounded almost ridiculously simple. But Karen had no idea that answering it would destroy the story she had spent weeks constructing. Eleanor Brooks had spent most of her life learning how to keep things that mattered. She kept birthday cards in a wooden drawer. She kept her sister Margaret's handwritten recipes in a plastic sleeve. She kept old photographs in envelopes marked with dates. And when Margaret died, Eleanor kept the little house exactly as her sister had left it for as long as she could. That was why the renovation was supposed to be simple. Fix the leaking roof, repair the kitchen, dot damaged flooring. Paint the bedrooms, then rent the house. Nothing about it was supposed to become a courtroom battle, but grief has a way of making ordinary decisions complicated. Eleanor was still grieving when Karen Whitmore offered to manage the repairs. Karen had met Margaret several times. She knew the neighborhood. She knew which contractors worked nearby. And she spoke with the reassuring confidence of someone who always seemed to have an answer. At first, Eleanor trusted her. The first payment was made without an argument. The first repairs appeared to go smoothly. Then the numbers changed. The original estimate had been $11,200. 2 weeks later, Karen said another $3,000 was necessary, then another $2,400, then another $1,200. Eleanor began asking questions. Karen began giving explanations, and eventually, according to Eleanor, the explanations stopped making sense. The visible case in front of Judge Judy was about $8,400. But that was not what Eleanor was really fighting for. She was fighting over the last responsibility her sister had left behind. She wanted the house repaired properly. She wanted to know where the money had gone. And more than anything, she wanted to stop feeling as though someone had taken advantage of her during the one period of her life when she was least prepared to fight back. That was why she kept the receipts. Not because she expected a lawsuit. Because Margaret had taught her never to throw away paperwork, Eleanor still remembered the exact words her sister used. Keep every receipt. People forget what they said. Paper doesn't. That sentence had stayed with her. So Eleanor kept everything, every invoice, every text message, every payment confirmation, every handwritten note. And eventually, one more thing, the brass key. It had belonged to Margaret. It opened the back storage room of the house. Eleanor had discovered it inside an old kitchen drawer after the funeral. At first, it seemed like nothing more than another piece of her sister's life. But months later, the key would become the most important object in the courtroom. Karen had a different explanation for the house. According to her, the storage room was not part of the renovation agreement. She said it was inaccessible. She said it had been filled with old household junk, and she insisted she had never entered it. That detail would have been easy to overlook, except Karen had already told Judge Judy something else. She had claimed she personally inspected every part of the property before creating the final invoice. Those two statements could not both be true. Judge Judy had noticed, Eleanor had not, Karen had not. But the judge had, and this was where the case began changing, because the strongest evidence in a courtroom is not always the document with the biggest number. Sometimes it is the contradiction hiding between two ordinary sentences. Judge Judy turned another page. She looked at Karen. "You suspected every room?" Karen nodded. "Yes." "Before the work began?" "Yes." "And the storage room?" Karen hesitated for the first time. It wasn't relevant. That answer made the courtroom quieter. Eleanor looked up. Karen immediately tried to recover. "It was just a storage area," she said. "There was nothing in there related to the repairs." Judge Judy studied her for several seconds. Then she asked Karen to explain why one of the invoices listed materials that Eleanor had never authorized. Karen said the materials had been needed. Judge Judy asked who approved them. Karen said Eleanor had. Eleanor shook her head. Karen smiled. "She probably doesn't remember." That sentence landed differently. The elderly woman did not argue. She simply reached into the brown envelope and removed a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table. It was a handwritten note. Margaret's handwriting. At the top was a date. Underneath was a short list of instructions about the house. Eleanor explained that her sister had written the note before she died. One sentence concerned the back storage room. Karen looked at it. Her expression changed, only slightly. But Judge Judy saw it. The courtroom had not yet seen the hidden connection. Karen had. The note did not prove everything. It did something more dangerous. It created a question Karen could not comfortably answer. Why had Margaret specifically written that the storage room was to remain locked? And why had Karen's invoice contained a charge for removing and replacing the very lock Margaret had warned Eleanor about? Karen shifted in her chair. For the first time, her perfectly organized folder seemed less impressive. Judge Judy leaned back. She did not accuse Karen of lying. Not yet. Instead, she asked a quieter question. "When did you last enter that room?" Karen stared at her. Then she said, "I never did." Judge Judy nodded slowly. Eleanor looked down at the brass key, the key that Karen had laughed at only minutes earlier, the key that appeared to be nothing. The key that suddenly seemed to matter very much because Eleanor remembered something Karen did not know she remembered. 3 days before the final invoice arrived, Eleanor had received a photograph on her phone. The photograph showed the inside of the locked storage room, and standing beside the shelves was Karen Whitmore. But there was a problem. Eleanor had never sent the photograph to Judge Judy. She had not even mentioned it in her original complaint. She had kept it hidden inside the same envelope as the key, and now Judge Judy was looking directly at that envelope. Karen still believed the photograph did not exist. That was about to change, because Judge Judy finally understood why Eleanor had brought the key. It was not evidence of ownership. It was a reminder. A reminder that someone had entered a room they claimed they never entered. The question was no longer whether Karen had completed the repairs. The question was why she had lied about being inside that room, and what she had been doing there. Judge Judy reached toward the brown envelope. Karen suddenly leaned forward. "Your Honor, I don't think that's relevant." The judge stopped. She looked at Karen, then at the envelope, then back at Karen, and the expression on her face made the room feel smaller because Karen had just made the one mistake Eleanor could not have made for her. She had told the judge exactly where to look. And inside that envelope was the first piece of evidence Karen had never prepared herself to explain. Karen Whitmore had walked into the courtroom believing the hardest part was already over. She had survived the paperwork. She had prepared her answers. She had brought photographs. She had even rehearsed the explanation for every extra charge. What she had not prepared for was a judge who cared more about contradictions than confidence. Karen was 46 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation as the person people called when they wanted a renovation handled without having to deal with the details. She was polished, organized, persuasive. And according to the people who knew her professionally, she had a talent for making complicated situations sound simple. That talent had helped her for years. But there was another side to Karen that Eleanor had discovered too late. Karen did not like being questioned. When someone challenged an invoice, Karen became offended. When someone asked for documentation, she called it distrust, and when someone refused to accept her explanation, she often changed the subject from what had happened to who was asking. That pattern had worked with contractors. It had worked with clients. It had even worked with Eleanor for a while, until Eleanor started keeping records. That was the difference. Karen had expected a grieving older woman to remember conversations. She had not expected that woman to remember dates. She had not expected receipts. She had not expected handwritten notes. And she certainly had not expected a key. When Karen entered the courtroom that morning, she looked like someone arriving to settle a minor disagreement. She wore a navy blazer. Her hair was perfectly arranged. Her folder was divided into labeled sections. She placed it on the table with deliberate confidence. Then she looked across at Eleanor. There was no fear in her expression. There was something closer to irritation, as if Eleanor had created an inconvenience by refusing to disappear quietly. The narrator watching the scene would have noticed the same thing Judge Judy noticed. Karen never once looked at the photographs of the house with sadness. She looked at them like accounting documents. To Karen, the property was a project. To Eleanor, it was the last physical piece of her sister's life. That difference explained almost everything, and it was about to become important. Karen's attorney began presenting the basic argument. The repairs had been completed. The additional work had been necessary. Eleanor had approved the changes. The final amount remained unpaid. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Then Karen started speaking for herself. She described Eleanor as confused. She said the older woman had misunderstood several conversations. She suggested Eleanor was emotionally overwhelmed after her sister's death, and then she made the statement that changed the temperature of the room. She keeps treating this like some personal betrayal, Karen said. It's a renovation bill. Eleanor looked at the table. Her lips tightened. Judge Judy watched Karen carefully. That sentence revealed more than Karen intended. The case was no longer simply about an unpaid bill. Karen was telling the courtroom that Eleanor's emotional attachment to the house was the problem. But emotional attachment did not explain missing receipts. It did not explain unexplained charges. And it certainly did not explain the locked storage room. Judge Judy turned toward Karen. You said you never entered that room? Yes, you're certain? Karen nodded. Absolutely. The answer came instantly. Too instantly, Judge Judy looked down at the documents. Then she looked at Eleanor. Do you have anything showing otherwise? Eleanor hesitated. Her hand moved toward the brown envelope. Karen noticed. Her shoulders stiffened. Your Honor, Karen said, whatever is in that envelope has nothing to do with the invoice. Judge Judy raised one hand. Karen stopped. The judge did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Let her speak. Eleanor slowly opened the envelope. She removed the brass key, then the handwritten note, then a photograph. Farron's face changed. It happened so quickly that someone sitting in the back of the courtroom might have missed it, but Judge Judy did not. The photograph showed the inside of the storage room. Old boxes lined one wall. A broken lamp sat near a shelf. A wooden trunk rested beneath a window. And standing beside the trunk was Karen. The photograph was dated 3 days before Karen's final invoice. Karen stared at it. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she laughed. It was a small, nervous laugh. That could be anybody. Eleanor looked at her. It isn't. Karen turned toward the judge. Your Honor, that photograph proves nothing. Judge Judy studied the image. Then she noticed something else. The photograph had been taken from inside the storage room, not through the doorway, not from the hall, from several feet inside. That meant whoever took it had entered the room, and Karen's own earlier testimony had placed her nowhere near it. Karen leaned forward. The photograph could have been altered. That was when Judge Judy asked the question that would eventually destroy the entire story. Not yet. First, she let Karen continue. Karen said Eleanor had become suspicious after the renovation. She said the photograph could have been taken by someone else. She said contractors had access to the property. She said Eleanor might have misunderstood who was standing in the picture. The more she talked, the more complicated her explanation became. That was another thing experienced judges learn. Truth usually has fewer moving parts. A lie requires maintenance. Every new explanation creates another place for the story to break. Judge Judy turned the photograph over. There was handwriting on the back, a date, a time, and 4 words. Karen had not noticed them. The judge read them silently. Then she looked at Karen. Karen's confidence returned for half a second. She thought the moment had passed. She thought the photograph had failed. Then Judge Judy placed it flat on the table. She looked directly at Karen and asked one simple question. Who took the picture? Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The courtroom became completely still. Because there were only a few possible answers, and every one of them created a problem. If Eleanor took it, Karen had been inside the locked room. If a contractor took it, Karen had to explain why she had denied entering the room while supervising the property. And if Karen took it herself, her previous testimony was finished. Karen swallowed. She looked toward her attorney. The attorney did not look back. For the first time that morning, Karen was no longer controlling the conversation. She was trying to survive it. But Judge Judy was not finished. Her eyes moved back to the little brass key, then to the photograph, then to the invoice. 3 ordinary pieces of evidence, 3 pieces that had seemed unrelated, until now. And somewhere inside, Karen's carefully prepared folder was a document that could connect all 3. Judge Judy reached for it. Karen saw the document before anyone else did, and the color drained from her face. Because she recognized the page. And she suddenly understood that the courtroom was about to see what she had been trying to hide. Karen stared at the document Judge Judy had pulled from her folder. For several seconds, she did not move. The confidence that had carried her through the first half of the hearing was gone. The courtroom could feel it. Eleanor could feel it. Even Karen's attorney seemed to understand what had happened. The judge had found the weak point, and now she was pressing it. Judge Judy held the document between her fingers. You submitted this invoice? Karen nodded slowly. Yes. You prepared it? Yes. And you stand by everything written here? Karen hesitated. Yes. Judge Judy placed the invoice beside the photograph. The 2 pieces of paper suddenly looked like parts of the same puzzle. One showed the storage room. The other listed a charge for replacing the lock on that room. Karen had claimed she never entered it, yet someone had photographed the inside. And someone had replaced the lock. Judge Judy looked at Karen. Who authorized this? Karen answered quickly. Mrs. Brooks. Eleanor shook her head. No. Karen turned toward her. You did. I did not. You absolutely did. Judge Judy raised her hand. Karen stopped. The judge's voice remained calm. Mrs. Whitmore, you're very certain about things that are becoming increasingly difficult to explain. The room went silent. Karen looked down. Judge Judy continued. You said Mrs. Brooks authorized the lock replacement. Yes. You said you never entered the storage room. Yes. And you said the photograph could have been taken by a contractor. Yes. Judge Judy nodded. Then let's make this simple. She turned the invoice around. At the bottom was a handwritten notation, not Eleanor's handwriting, not a contractor's, Karen's. Next to the lock replacement charge were 3 words. Asterisk, already handled personally. Eleanor stared at the page. Karen's attorney closed his eyes. The judge looked at Karen. What does that mean? Karen's lips parted. Nothing came out. This was the moment the entire courtroom finally understood why Judge Judy had been so patient. She had not been waiting for a confession. She had been waiting for Karen to create one herself, Karen tried to explain. She said the note had been written during a hectic day. She said personally did not necessarily mean she had entered the room. She said she could have been referring to a contractor. But the explanation only created another problem. Judge Judy pointed to the date. Who was the contractor? Karen named a man. Judge Judy looked at the paperwork. The contractor's name did not appear anywhere on the invoice. Then she looked at another page, a payment record. The contractor had been paid for the roof, not the storage room, not the lock. Not the materials Karen had listed. The first proof had created doubt. The second proof had created tension. Now the third piece was changing the entire case. Judge Judy turned to Eleanor. Did you ever give Karen permission to enter that room? No. Did you ever give her permission to replace the lock? No. Did you know she had entered it? Eleanor looked down. No. Her voice became quieter. I found out because my sister's box was missing. Karen immediately leaned forward. That is not true. Judge Judy looked at her. What's missing? Karen froze. Eleanor opened the brown envelope again. This time she removed a small photograph of an old wooden box. It had belonged to Margaret. Inside were letters, photographs, and several personal papers. Eleanor explained that the box had been stored in the back room after Margaret's death. When Eleanor returned to the property after the repairs, the box was gone. She had asked Karen about it. Karen had denied knowing anything. That was when the case stopped being about renovation costs. The missing box explained why Eleanor had kept the photograph. It explained why she had kept the key. And it explained why she had refused to simply accept Karen's invoice. She wasn't chasing $8,000. She wanted to know what had happened to the last pieces of her sister's life. Karen's expression hardened. You have no proof I took anything. Judge Judy looked at her. No one said you took it. Karen stopped. The judge let the silence sit. Then she continued. But you keep defending yourself against accusations nobody has made. The attorney lowered his head. Eleanor looked at Karen. Karen looked away. That was the psychological turning point. Until then, Karen had behaved as though she were defending a business dispute. Now she was reacting as though she were defending something much more personal. And Judge Judy noticed bodies confess before mouths do. Sometimes it happens through a sentence, sometimes through a glance, and sometimes through the desperate need to answer a question nobody asked. Judge Judy reached for another document. This one was smaller. A property access log. Eleanor had obtained it from the management company that maintained the security system for the neighborhood. Karen had insisted she had never entered the storage room. But the access log showed something else. 3 days before the final invoice, Karen's access code had been used at the property. The time was 8:14 p.m., the same date written on the photograph. Farron stared at the log. That doesn't prove it was me. Judge Judy nodded. Fair enough. Karen exhaled. For a moment, she looked relieved. Then Judge Judy asked the question, Who else had your access code? Karen's mouth opened. She looked toward her attorney. The attorney did not answer. Karen looked back at the judge. I don't remember. There it was, the answer that changed everything. because Karen had spent the morning telling the court Eleanor was confused because she could not remember certain conversations. Now, Karen could not remember who had access to her own code. Judge Judy leaned back. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked at Karen as though the final piece had finally arrived. Before the truth comes out, comment below what you think Judge Judy found inside that file. Because the next piece of evidence was not a photograph, it was not an invoice. And it was not a receipt, it was a recording. Judge Judy opened a small folder. Karen's face went pale. The attorney whispered something to her. Karen shook her head. No. Judge Judy looked at the courtroom monitor. Then at Karen, the judge pressed a button. And the first few seconds of the recording filled the courtroom. Karen heard her own voice. And suddenly, everyone knew the story was about to end very differently than she had planned. Karen's own voice came through the courtroom speakers. I told her the back room wasn't part of the agreement. Eleanor's eyes widened. Karen looked toward her attorney. The attorney did not move. The recording continued. A man's voice could be heard faintly in the background. Then Karen spoke again. She doesn't need to know what was in there. Just get the lock changed before she comes back. The courtroom froze. Eleanor covered her mouth. Karen immediately shook her head. That is not what it sounds like. Judge Judy stopped the recording. She looked at Karen. What does it sound like? Karen had no answer. The recording had done something no argument could do. It had removed interpretation. Karen could claim Eleanor misunderstood. She could claim the photograph was altered. She could claim the access code belonged to someone else. But the voice on the recording was hers, and the words were unmistakable. Judge Judy played the next section. Karen's voice returned. The box stays where it is. Nobody touches it until I know what's inside. Eleanor looked toward the judge. My sister's box. Judge Judy nodded. Karen's face had lost all color. The courtroom suddenly understood the deeper truth. Karen had not simply entered the storage room. She had known about Margaret's box. She had specifically discussed keeping it untouched. And yet, according to Eleanor, the box disappeared shortly afterward. Karen tried to speak. I never took it. Judge Judy looked at her. Agin, she did not accuse her. She simply asked, Where is it? Karen stared at the table. I don't know. Judge Judy waited. Karen repeated herself. I don't know. The judge turned toward Eleanor. Did you ever see the box again? No. Did Karen ever tell you what happened to it? No. Judge Judy looked back at Karen. Then why were you discussing it? Karen's attorney finally stood. Your Honor, my client may have been discussing property that was temporarily being moved during construction. Judge Judy looked at him. Then why did she say Mrs. Brooks didn't need to know? The attorney sat down. There was nothing left to say. That sentence had changed the entire case. The renovation dispute had been a doorway. Behind it was something much more personal. Karen had discovered that Margaret's box contained old letters and documents. And according to the recording, she had wanted time to find out what was inside. Eleanor suddenly remembered something she had forgotten. 2 weeks before the hearing, Karen had called her. She had asked whether Margaret had left behind any old business records. Eleanor had thought the question was strange. Now it made sense. The box had contained more than family photographs. It contained documents connected to a property Margaret had once owned with another person. Documents Eleanor had never seen, and Karen had discovered them while working inside the storage room. But there was another twist. Judge Judy opened the final folder. Inside was a copy of an old agreement. Margaret's name appeared at the top. So did Karen's. Eleanor stared at the page. She had never seen it before. Karen had once helped Margaret with a separate property matter. The agreement showed that Karen had received a percentage of certain proceeds if the property was eventually sold. But Margaret had died before the sale. Karen had never disclosed the agreement to Eleanor. And now the missing box suddenly had a reason to matter. Karen had a financial interest in documents connected to Margaret's old property. The simple renovation dispute had been hiding a conflict of interest. Karen had presented herself as a contractor helping a grieving woman. But she had another reason to be interested in what Margaret had left behind. Judge Judy placed the agreement next to the invoice. Then she placed the photograph beside them, then the access log, then the handwritten note. The pieces were finally aligned. The key, the photograph, the invoice, the access code, the recording, the old agreement. Each piece had seemed small by itself. Together, they told one story. Karen's story was no longer holding. Judge Judy looked at her. "You told this court you never entered that room." Karen said nothing. "You told this court Mrs. Brooks authorized the lock replacement." Silence. "You told this court the photograph could have been taken by somebody else." Karen lowered her eyes. "And you told this court you didn't know who had access to your security code." Karen's hands tightened around the edge of the table. Judge Judy leaned forward. "Yet your voice is on a recording discussing that room." Karen's eyes filled with panic. "That doesn't prove I took the box." Judge Judy nodded. "No, it doesn't." Karen looked up. For one brief second, relief appeared on her face. Then Judge Judy continued. "But it proves your testimony about that room was false." The relief vanished. That was the moment Karen finally understood the difference between losing an argument and losing credibility. A courtroom does not need every mystery solved before a lie becomes important. One false statement can change how every other statement is examined. Eleanor had spent weeks wondering whether anyone would believe her. Now she did not need to convince anyone. The evidence was doing the work. Judge Judy turned to the missing box issue. She asked whether Karen knew where it was. Karen said no. Judge Judy asked whether Karen had ever removed anything from the property. Again, Karen said no. Then the judge produced one final photograph. This one had been taken by a neighbor's security camera. It showed Karen leaving the property late that evening. In her hands was a medium-sized wooden box. Karen stared at the screen. She could not speak. Eleanor closed her eyes. The courtroom remained silent. The box was never recovered during the hearing, but the image was enough to destroy Karen's final defense. The defendant had entered the room. She had discussed the box. She had arranged for the lock to be changed. She had denied entering the room. And she had later been recorded leaving the property carrying something that looked exactly like the missing box. Judge Judy did not need to shout. She simply looked at Karen. The woman who had entered the courtroom believing she could control the story was now sitting inside a story the evidence had written for her. And there was still one final question. What would Judge Judy do with everything she had just uncovered? The answer would not simply determine how much Eleanor received. It would decide whether Karen walked out of that courtroom as a businesswoman who lost a dispute or as someone whose own words had triggered consequences far beyond the original claim. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Judy looked at the evidence spread across the bench. The original invoice, the handwritten note, the brass key, the photograph, the access record, the recording. And finally, the security image showing Karen leaving the property with the wooden box. None of those pieces alone had explained everything. Together, they had changed the case completely. Judge Judy turned toward Karen. "This case began as a payment dispute," she said. "It isn't one anymore." Karen sat motionless. The woman who had entered the courtroom with a carefully prepared story now had nothing left to organize. Her own statements had become evidence against her credibility. Judge Judy reviewed the financial claim first. Karen had demanded $8,400. But the invoices contained charges Eleanor had never authorized, including the lock replacement and several materials that had no supporting receipts. The judge rejected those charges. Then she addressed the deeper issue. Karen had repeatedly denied entering the storage room. The photograph contradicted that. The access record contradicted that. The recording contradicted that. And the security image created an even more serious problem. Judge Judy looked at Karen. You didn't just make a mistake. Karen swallowed. You built your entire claim around statements that the evidence doesn't support. Karen's attorney attempted to respond. Judge Judy stopped him with a glance. The courtroom had reached the point where explanations were no longer helping. The evidence had already spoken. Judge Judy ordered the $8,400 claim dismissed. She also awarded Eleanor damages for the unauthorized charges and directed the matter concerning the missing property and disputed documents to the appropriate authorities for further review. The exact amount mattered. But it was not the most important part of the verdict. Eleanor had spent weeks wondering whether anyone would believe her. Now she did not have to wonder anymore. Judge Judy looked toward her. Mrs. Brooks, you were right to keep your records. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at the brass key. That little piece of metal had started the morning looking almost worthless. Now it represented something else. It represented memory. It represented caution. And, most importantly, it represented the decision not to let someone else rewrite what had happened. Then Judge Judy delivered the line the courtroom would remember. People can disguise a mistake, but they cannot disguise a pattern when the evidence keeps telling the same story. Karen lowered her head. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, no final argument, just silence. And somehow that made the moment more powerful. Karen had arrived believing Eleanor was too emotional to remember the truth. She had underestimated the woman completely. Eleanor had remembered dates. She had kept receipts. She had preserved her sister's handwriting. She had saved the key. And when Karen attacked her credibility, Eleanor did not fight back with anger. She brought evidence. That was the real power reversal. The woman who looked less prepared had actually been carrying the strongest defense in the room. The consequences did not end when the courtroom doors closed. Within 24 hours, the disputed renovation records were being reviewed. Within 48 hours, the property management company provided additional access information connected to the investigation. And within 72 hours, Eleanor learned that the wooden box had been located in a storage facility connected to someone Karen knew. The contents were still being examined. But Eleanor's sister's letters were there. So were the photographs. And several documents Eleanor had believed were gone forever. The box was returned to her. She did not celebrate. She simply held it against her chest for a moment and closed her eyes. Because the value of that box had never been measured in dollars. It contained pieces of Margaret that could never be replaced. A handwritten recipe, an old photograph, a birthday card, and a letter Eleanor had never known her sister had written. That was the moment the entire dispute finally became clear. This case had never really been about $8,400. It had been about whether someone could walk into another person's grief, take advantage of their trust, and then convince them that their own memory could not be trusted. Karen had tried to make Eleanor doubt herself. But Eleanor had done something much stronger. She had remembered, and she had kept the proof. The brass key eventually went back into Eleanor's drawer. Not because it was valuable, because it reminded her of the morning when one small object helped uncover a much larger truth. And that is what makes courtroom stories like this unforgettable. The truth does not always arrive with a dramatic confession. Sometimes it arrives as a receipt folded inside an envelope. Sometimes it arrives as a photograph someone forgot existed. Sometimes it arrives as a sentence recorded when nobody thought anyone was listening. And sometimes all it takes is one simple question. Karen thought the courtroom would revolve around her story. Judge Judy understood that the courtroom revolved around whether that story could survive the evidence. It couldn't. Because confidence can make a lie sound convincing. Preparation can make it sound organized. And arrogance can make someone believe nobody will challenge it. But evidence has a strange quality. It does not become nervous. It does not forget, it does not change its story because the room becomes uncomfortable. Eleanor walked out of the courtroom carrying the same brown envelope she had brought in. But something inside her had changed. She no longer looked like someone asking to be believed. She looked like someone who finally knew she had been right to believe herself. And perhaps that was the quietest justice of all. The person who had tried to make her feel invisible had failed. The woman who had been dismissed as confused had remembered every important detail. And the little brass key that Karen had laughed at became the symbol of the entire case, because sometimes the smallest piece of evidence opens the biggest door. If this fictional courtroom story reminded you that truth can survive even the most confident lie, subscribe for more courtroom stories where arrogance finally meets consequences. And comment below. If you had been sitting in that courtroom, when do you think you would have realized Karen's story was falling apart?